No one could explain what they were seeing, only that the bleeding had stopped. In a trauma bay, flooded with red where monitors screamed and doctors were already preparing the words, "Time of death," a quiet nurse stepped forward. She didn't ask permission. She didn't reach for tools. She placed her hands in a way no one recognized, applying pressure where no textbook ever pointed. The room froze. Someone shouted that she was violating protocol. Another voice said it was too late anyway. Then the numbers on the monitor changed. Heart rate steadied. Blood loss slowed. Silence crashed down harder than the alarms ever had. One doctor whispered, shaken, "That's not medicine." Hours later, long after the ER lights dimmed, a secure line rang in the hospital administrator's office. The caller didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. His first words were enough to drain the color from the room. "This is the Pentagon. We need to speak to the woman who stopped the bleeding before midnight. Before the story begins, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you're drawn to stories where quiet courage changes everything, don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next." The emergency department of St. Jude Regional Medical Center never truly slept. Even at 3 in the morning, fluorescent lights hummed, carts rattled over tile, and the low murmur of controlled urgency filled the air like a constant pulse. But that evening the ER felt different, tighter, heavier, as if the building itself sensed what was coming. Emily Carter stood near the trauma desk, hands folded loosely in front of her eyes, scanning the status board without really reading it. At 32, she looked younger than most of the nurses assigned to high-acuity trauma, slim build, calm posture, brown hair tied back with clinical neatness. No jewelry, no visible tattoos. Nothing about her drew attention, and she preferred it that way. She had transferred to St. Jude 3 months earlier, quietly, without ceremony. Her file was thin. Certified trauma nurse. Solid evaluations. No disciplinary notes. No glowing letters of recommendation either. Just adequate. That was the word most people used when they talked about her, if they talked about her at all. Carter. She looked up instantly. Dr. Michael Hargreaves stood several feet away, arms crossed over his chest, his white coat crisp despite the long shift. As head of trauma surgery, Hargreaves ran the ER like a command post. Every decision flowed through him. Every deviation irritated him. "You're on secondary support tonight," he said. "IVs. Monitoring. Follow instructions exactly." Emily nodded once. "Understood." Hargreaves paused, clearly waiting for more gratitude, reassurance, maybe a question. When none came, his jaw tightened. "Let's keep it clean tonight," he added. "No improvising." "Yes, sir," Emily replied evenly. As he turned away, a nurse at the adjacent station leaned closer. "Don't take it personally," whispered Jenna Morales, a senior ER nurse with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. "He doesn't like quiet people. Makes him nervous." Emily gave a small, polite smile. "I'm fine." She always said that. At 7:42 p.m., the first alert came in multi-vehicle collision on Highway 61, 12 miles south. EMS reported 1 critical, several moderate. ETA 10 minutes. The ER shifted gears instantly. Gurneys were prepped. Trauma kits opened. Respiratory rolled in equipment. "Doctor," Hargreaves took position at the center, issuing clipped orders with practiced authority. Emily moved where she was told, setting up IV lines, checking suction, preparing blood tubing. Her movements were precise, economical, no wasted steps. If anyone noticed, they didn't comment. The ambulance doors burst open at 7:53. Male, approximately 35. The paramedic shouted as they wheeled the patient in. Blunt force trauma, suspected internal bleeding, hypotensive, tachycardic. Lost consciousness twice, en route. The patient's clothes were cut away quickly. Blood stained the gurney beneath him, darker than it should have been, pooling too fast. BP's dropping, someone called out. "Get me a fast scan," Hargreaves snapped. 2 large-bore IVs now. Emily stepped in smoothly, inserting a line with practiced ease. Her eyes flicked to the monitor, heart rate climbing past 140, blood pressure sinking. This wasn't good. As the ultrasound probe moved across the patient's abdomen, Hargreaves' expression darkened. "Free fluid," he muttered. "A lot of it. Internal hemorrhage. Possibly multiple sources." "Prep or 1, he ordered. "We're losing him." The room buzzed with controlled chaos, voices overlapping equipment moving fast, but underneath it all, Emily felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear. Recognition. She watched the patient's skin tone shift, the subtle slackening of muscle tone that others often missed until it was too late. She listened not just to the monitor but to the rhythm of breathing, the faint changes in sound as air moved through damaged tissue. Her hands curled slightly at her sides. Then the numbers dropped hard. "Systolics crashing," Jenna shouted. "We're at 60. Start massive transfusion protocol," Hargreave barked. Blood flowed. Pressure was applied. Medications pushed. Nothing held. The bleeding wasn't external. It was deep, chaotic, something torn and hidden, something that refused to respond to standard intervention. "We're out of time," Hargreave said grimly. "If we don't stabilize him in the next 2 minutes." Emily took one step forward before she realized she was moving. "Doctor," she said. Hargreave turned sharply. "What? There's another option." The room stilled just enough for the words to land. Hargreave stared at her. "Excuse me," Emily's voice stayed level, but her pulse spiked. "I can slow the bleeding. Temporarily. Enough to get him upstairs." A beat. Then disbelief rippled through the room, with what one resident asked. Emily didn't answer immediately. She was already looking at the patient, not as a chart, not as a case, but as a system. Vessels. Pressure points. Angles of trauma. Hargreave let out a short, humorless laugh. "This is not the time for experiments, Nurse Carter." "It's not an experiment," Emily said quietly. That made him snap. "You do not get to override medical protocol because you feel something," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Step back. Now." Emily hesitated for half a second. In that half second, the monitor dipped again. Flat almost. Something shifted in the room, not chaos this time, but dread. Emily moved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She placed her hands on the patient's torso in a precise, unfamiliar position, applying pressure with a focus that bordered on unnatural. Her posture changed completely, grounded, controlled, every muscle engaged. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. "That's not compression," a resident murmured. "It's wrong." Hargreave surged forward. "Get your hands off. Wait," Jenna said suddenly. Everyone looked at the monitor. The heart rate slowed. Not much. Just enough to notice. Blood flow on the sheets lessened, not stopped but redirected, delayed, as if something unseen had shifted course beneath the skin. The room fell silent. Emily didn't look up. Sweat beaded at her temples, but her hands didn't shake. Her breathing was measured, deliberate. Seconds stretched. Then BP's rising, the resident said, disbelief creeping into his voice. 70. No, 78. Hargreave stared, stunned. "What is that?" he whispered. Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "It won't hold forever." The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room, because for the first time that night the patient wasn't dying, and no one in that ER could explain why. For a moment, no one moved. The trauma bay felt suspended in time, monitors ticking softly, IV pumps humming, the metallic scent of blood hanging thick in the air. Emily Carter remained where she was, hands locked in position, her shoulders squared as if bracing against an invisible force. Every instinct in her body was focused on maintaining pressure at exactly the right angle, exactly the right depth. "Talk to me, doctor," Hargreave said at last, his voice low, cautious now instead of sharp. "What are you doing?" Emily didn't look up. "Buying time." "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters right now." The resident closest to the monitor swallowed. "Vitals are stabilizing," he said. "Barely, but they're holding." Hargreave's jaw tightened. Years of training screamed at him that this was wrong, untested, undocumented, dangerous. But the numbers didn't lie. The patient was still alive. "How long?" Hargreave asked. Emily exhaled slowly. "Maybe 3 minutes. 4 if we're lucky." "That's it." "Yes." Hargreave turned sharply. "Prep or 1. Now. Move." The room exploded back into motion. Gurney locks released. Doors flew open. A surgical team mobilized with renewed urgency. Emily moved with them, never breaking contact, her steps, measured as the patient was rushed down the corridor toward the operating room. As they moved, murmurs followed. "What kind of technique is that? Is it some kind of nerve compression? I've never seen anything like it." Emily heard none of it or pretended not to. Her world had narrowed to pressure, angle, breath. She counted silently in her head, tracking seconds, feeling subtle changes beneath her palms that only she seemed to notice. At the OR doors, she finally stepped back. The sudden release made her sway slightly. Jenna caught her elbow without a word. "You okay?" Jenna whispered. Emily nodded, though her hands trembled faintly now that the moment had passed. "He's got less than a minute once I let go," she said. "You need to be fast." Hargreave didn't respond. He was already scrubbing in his mind, racing, replaying what he'd seen. Whatever Emily had done, it had worked. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough. As the OR doors swung shut, Emily stood alone in the hallway, the adrenaline draining from her system all at once. The familiar hollow feeling followed a mix of relief and something heavier she never quite named. She leaned against the wall, eyes closed. It had been years since she'd done that. Carter. She opened her eyes. Hargreave stood a few feet away, mask hanging loose around his neck, surgical cap still on. Up close, his expression was harder to read. Less anger now, more calculation. "That technique," he said. "Where did you learn it?" Emily met his gaze steadily. "It's not something you teach in nursing school." "That's obvious," he replied. "It's also not in any trauma manual I've ever read." She said nothing. Hargreave studied her for a long moment, then turned as the OR doors opened again. A circulating nurse stepped out. "He's stable," she said. "For now." A collective breath seemed to pass through the hallway. Hargreave nodded once, then looked back at Emily. "My office." Now, the walk down the corridor felt longer than it should have. Emily's pulse slowed with each step, her mind already shifting into a different kind of alertness. This part, explaining, justifying, had always been harder than the moment of action. Hargreave closed the door behind them with a decisive click. "Sit," he said. Emily remained standing. "Please," he added after a beat. She sat. Hargreave leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. "You acted without authorization. You violated protocol in a critical situation. You put your hands on a patient in a way I cannot document, defend, or explain." "I know," Emily said quietly. "Then why did you do it?" "Because he was going to die," she replied, "and because I knew he didn't have to." Hargreave exhaled sharply. "That's not how this works." "No," Emily agreed. "It isn't." Silence settled between them. Finally, Hargreave spoke again, more controlled now. "If that patient survives, and that's still a big if, I'm going to be asked questions. Administration will want answers. Risk management will want blood." Emily nodded. "I understand. You understand that this could cost you your job, yes. Your license, yes." Hargreave searched her face, clearly expecting fear or at least hesitation. He found neither. "What are you not telling me, Nurse Carter?" Emily's fingers curled slowly in her lap. "Some things don't belong in charts." "That's not an acceptable answer. It's the only honest one." Hargreave straightened, irritation flaring again. "You don't get to decide that." Emily met his gaze, calm but unyielding. "Tonight I did." The words hung heavy in the air. Before Hargreave could respond, there was a knock at the door. A hospital administrator poked his head in, looking unusually tense. "Doctor," he said. "We have a situation." Hargreave frowned. "What kind of situation?" "There's been a request," the administrator said carefully. "For the patient, and for Nurse Carter." Emily felt a subtle shift deep in her chest. "From who?" Hargreave asked. The administrator hesitated. They wouldn't say. Just that it was federal. Hargreave's eyes flicked to Emily, then back. "That doesn't make any sense." "It didn't to me either," the man admitted. "But they knew details about the case that aren't in the system yet. And they asked that we restrict access to the patient's file immediately." Emily stood slowly. "Did they say when they'd follow up?" The administrator blinked. "No, just that we should be prepared." Hargreave looked between them, something like unease settling in his expression, prepared for what Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "For questions." The administrator nodded and left. The door closed again, sealing the room in silence. Hargreave stared at Emily, a thousand unspoken possibilities flashing across his face. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Emily didn't answer right away. Outside, the steady rhythm of the hospital continued, stretchers, rolling voices calling out vitals, life and death, carrying on as it always did. But beneath it all, something had changed. "I'm just a nurse," Emily said at last. Hargreave knew in his bones that it wasn't true. And somewhere deep within the hospital systems, a digital lock snapped into place around the patient's file, sealed by an authority far above St. Jude's pay grade. The operating room doors stayed closed for nearly 2 hours. During that time, the rest of St. Jude Regional moved on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. A teenager with appendicitis was wheeled past the nurse's station. An elderly woman complained loudly about the cold. Phones rang. Charts were updated. Shift changes were discussed in hushed, tired voices. But for the people who had been in Trauma Bay 3, the air felt permanently altered. Emily Carter sat alone in the staff break room, a paper cup of coffee cooling untouched in her hands. The tremor in her fingers had faded, replaced by a dull ache that ran from her shoulders down her spine. It was a familiar sensation muscle memory from a life she rarely allowed herself to remember. She stared at the far wall, not really seeing it. Every instinct told her she had just crossed a line she had spent years carefully avoiding. The door opened. Jenna slipped inside and closed it quietly behind her. "They're still operating," she said softly. Emily nodded. He was unstable. "It'll take time." Jenna studied her for a long moment. "What you did back there, that wasn't luck." "No," Emily said. "It also wasn't anything I've ever seen." Jenna lowered her voice further. "And I've been here 12 years. Emily finally looked at her. "I'm sorry." Jenna frowned. "For what?" "For putting you in that position," Jenna snorted. "Please, I'd rather explain a miracle than a death." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been hanging between them since the trauma bay. "Where did you learn to do that?" Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "A long time ago." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Before Jenna could push further, the overhead speaker crackled to life. "Dr. Hargreave to A1. Dr. Hargreave to A1. Jenna's gaze sharpened. "That's him." Emily set the coffee down and stood. "Then it's time." They walked back toward the surgical wing together, footsteps echoing faintly against polished floors. As they approached, they saw Dr. Hargreave already there, speaking in low, urgent tones with 2 men Emily didn't recognize. They weren't dressed like doctors. No white coats, no scrubs, dark jackets, close-cropped hair. The way they stood, feet planted, shoulders squared, set off something instinctive in Emily's mind. Authority, but not hospital authority. One of them noticed her immediately. "Emily Carter," he said, not asking. Her spine straightened. "Yes." Dr. Hargreave turned sharply. "You know her." The man ignored the question. "We need to speak with you." "Privately." Hargreave bristled. "You can't just walk into my OR and start." "I think we can," the second man said, calmly producing a badge Emily didn't quite catch before it disappeared again. "This is a matter of national interest." The words hit like a dropped instrument, sharp, metallic, impossible to ignore. Hargreave stared. "That's absurd." "Is it?" the first man replied. "Your patient survived an injury profile that should have killed him in under 8 minutes. According to our data, the only documented cases of similar survivals involved a very specific hemorrhage control technique." Emily closed her eyes for half a second. So it had begun. The OR doors opened at that moment and the lead surgeon stepped out, pulling off his gloves. "He's alive," he said. "Barely. But we've stabilized the bleeding. We still don't know how he held on that long." The first man nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he looked back at Emily. "You held the bleed," he said. Emily didn't deny it. "We've been tracking that method for years," he continued. "It's not taught in civilian systems. Not published. Not even formally acknowledged." Hargreave looked between them, color draining from his face. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," the man replied evenly, "that Nurse Carter used a technique developed for environments where evacuation isn't guaranteed and surgeons aren't available." Silence spread through the corridor like spilled ink. Hargreave's voice came out hoarse. "That's impossible." Emily finally spoke. "It's not." The second man checked his watch. "We don't have much time. Higher command wants a confirmation call before midnight." "Midnight," Jenna echoed. "Why midnight?" The man's eyes flicked to her, then away. "Because after that, the questions get louder." Emily felt the familiar weight settle in her chest, the same pressure she'd felt years ago when silence had been the only shield she had. "Come with us," the first man said. "Just to talk." Hargreaves stepped forward. She's my staff. You don't get to. Emily raised a hand gently. It's okay. Everyone turned to look at her. I'll talk, she said, but I'm not leaving the hospital. The man considered her for a moment, then nodded. That's acceptable. They moved to a small consultation room at the end of the hall. The door closed softly behind them, sealing out the noise of the ER. The first man finally introduced himself. My name is Daniel Ross. This is Mark Ellison. Emily recognized the cadence, immediately controlled, deliberate. Military. You know why we're here, Ross said. Emily met his gaze. I know why you think you're here. Ross's lips twitched. Fair enough. We know that technique. We know where it came from. What we don't know is why you're here, working 12-hour shifts in a civilian trauma center under a name that barely registers in federal systems. Ellison leaned forward slightly. You disappeared. Emily's voice stayed steady. I resigned. You don't resign from that program, Ross said quietly. You do, she replied, if you're willing to lose everything else. Silence stretched again. Ross exhaled slowly. The man you saved tonight isn't just anyone. Emily's eyes narrowed. I figured. He's a contractor, Ross continued, embedded overseas. He was injured stateside during a transfer. His survival matters. Emily absorbed that without visible reaction. Everyone's survival matters. Ross studied her. That's not how the Pentagon usually sees it. Then that's their problem, Emily said. Ellison checked his phone, then looked up. They want to speak to you directly. Emily felt the weight of the past press harder now. Faces, voices, orders given and followed. Lines crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. When she asked, Ross's answer was quiet. Tonight. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. And for the first time since she'd stepped into Trauma Bay, 3 Emily Carter wondered if the life she'd built in silence was about to be taken from her, whether she wanted it to be or not. The consultation room felt smaller the longer they sat in it. The walls were bare, painted a neutral beige meant to calm anxious families. Tonight it did the opposite. Emily Carter sat upright in the plastic chair, hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes fixed on the clock mounted above the door. The red second hand swept forward with relentless precision, counting down to something she had spent years pretending would never catch up to her. Daniel Ross stood near the window, arms crossed. Mark Ellison leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone before slipping it back into his jacket. Neither man spoke for several long moments. Finally, Ross broke the silence. You didn't just save his life, he said. You changed a timeline. Emily's gaze didn't shift. He was bleeding. Yes, Ross replied. And he shouldn't have survived that pattern of injury. Not without immediate surgical intervention. Not without resources that didn't exist in that room. Ellison added quietly, except you. Emily inhaled slowly. If you're here to thank me, you can stop. Ross turned, studying her more closely now. That's not why we're here. I know. Outside the room, footsteps passed. Voices echoed briefly, then faded. The hospital continued on, blissfully unaware that something far larger than an internal investigation was unfolding behind this closed door. Ross checked his watch again. We have less than 40 minutes. Emily finally looked up. Until midnight. Yes. And after midnight, she asked. Ross hesitated. After midnight, this becomes harder to contain. Ellison pushed off the counter. Once certain systems update, certain alerts can't be rolled back. Questions get flagged. Names surface. Emily nodded once. She had always known that anonymity came with an expiration date. Let's be clear, she said. I'm not going back. Ross met her gaze. We're not here to force you back into service. That's a lie, Emily replied calmly. Ross didn't deny it. It's a partial truth. Before Emily could respond, the door opened abruptly. Doctor. Michael Hargreaves stood in the doorway, his expression tight eyes flicking from Ross to Ellison to Emily. You don't get to close ranks around my staff without involving me, he said sharply. Ross turned to face him. With respect, Doctor, this extends beyond hospital administration. Hargreaves' jaw clenched. Everything that happens in this building is my responsibility. Emily stood. It's okay, Dr. Hargreave. He turned to her, frustration flaring. No, it's not. You saved a life tonight, and now you're being interrogated by men who won't even tell me who they work for. Ellison reached into his jacket again, and this time held his badge long enough for Hargreave to see it clearly. Hargreave's expression changed, not to fear exactly, but to something colder, recognition. "You should have disclosed this," he said slowly. "You should have asked the right questions," Ellison replied. Emily stepped between them slightly, an unconscious movement. "This isn't his fault." Hargreave looked at her, searching her face. "Emily," he said quietly, "what is going on?" She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she answered honestly. "I didn't lie to you," she said. "But I didn't tell you everything either. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be." Another silence settled in, heavier, now layered with unspoken truths. Ross cleared his throat. "Doctor, the patient you operated on tonight, his file has been temporarily restricted." Hargreave stiffened. "By whom?" "By people with jurisdiction," Ross said. "That will be formalized after midnight." "And my staff?" Hargreave asked. "My nurses." "What happens to them?" Ross looked at Emily. "That depends on what happens in the next 37 minutes. Emily felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Ross exhaled. "Confirmation. Of what that you are who we believe you to be," Ross said. "And that the technique you used tonight is the same one documented under a different name, in a different place, under circumstances that were never meant to reach civilian medicine." Emily's jaw tightened. "I didn't invent it." "No," Ross agreed. "You perfected it." Ellison added, "You were one of 3. The other 2 are gone." Emily's breath caught for half a second, so brief no one else noticed, but enough to betray something buried deep. "They didn't make it out," she said quietly. Ross nodded. "We know." Hargreave looked between them, clearly piecing together fragments he didn't like. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that my nurse learned this in combat." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Yes." The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Hargreave ran a hand through his hair. "Then why are you here? Why this hospital? Why now?" Emily answered without hesitation. "Because people still bleed here." Ross studied her, something like respect flickering across his face. "That answer hasn't changed." Ellison's phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked up. "We have 25 minutes. Hargreave let out a short laugh, bitter. "You're counting down to something you won't even explain." Ross met his gaze. "Because explaining it would put you in a position you didn't ask for." "Neither did she," Hargreave shot back, nodding toward Emily. Silence. Emily straightened her shoulders. "I'll confirm what you need," she said, "but on my terms." Ross raised an eyebrow. "Which are?" "No return to active operations," Emily said firmly. "No press, no exposure, and no interference with my job here." Ellison frowned. "You can't guarantee that." "I can walk away right now," Emily replied. "Let your timelines collapse. Let your questions go unanswered." Ross held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You always did know where the leverage was." Hargreave stared at them both. "You're negotiating with the Pentagon." "In my consultation room." Emily allowed herself a faint, humorless smile. "I promised I wouldn't improvise, Doctor." Ross stepped closer. "We'll make the call," when Emily asked. At 11:58, Ross replied, "You'll speak, you'll confirm, and then we'll reassess." Emily nodded. "Fine." Ellison checked his watch again. "We'll need privacy." Hargreave opened his mouth to object, then stopped. He looked at Emily instead. "You should have told me," he said quietly. She met his gaze, regret flickering briefly across her features. "You wouldn't have believed me." He didn't argue, because deep down he knew she was right. As Ross and Ellison stepped out to prepare the secure line, Emily remained in the room with Hargreave. The clock ticked loudly now. "You saved that man," Hargreave said finally. Emily nodded. "That was the job." "No," he replied. "That was more than the job." She looked away. Outside, somewhere above the hospital, the wind shifted across the helipad. And far beyond St. Jude, regional systems far larger than any one hospital adjusted quietly, methodically, preparing for the moment when the clock struck midnight. At 1:141 p.m., the hospital felt unnaturally quiet. Not silent. St. Jude never truly went silent, but muted, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The late-night lull had settled in the brief window when fewer ambulances arrived, and the waiting room lights dimmed just enough to let exhaustion seep into every corner. Inside the consultation room, the clock's ticking had grown impossibly loud. Emily Carter stood near the wall, now arms folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She had learned long ago that waiting was its own kind of trial, in some ways harder than action. When you acted, you controlled something. When you waited, you surrendered control to forces that rarely cared what you wanted. Doctor. Hargreaves stood across from her posture, rigid, his earlier authority stripped down to something more human unease. He kept glancing at the door as if expecting it to open again at any second. "They're not coming back in here, are they?" he asked quietly. Emily didn't answer right away. "They will," she said, "when the line is ready." Hargreaves shook his head. "This doesn't feel real. I run trauma for a living. I deal with death every day. But this," he gestured vaguely, "this feels like I stepped into someone else's war." Emily's jaw tightened. "You did." That earned her a sharp look. "And you didn't think that was something your department head deserved to know. I thought," Emily said carefully, "that the safest thing for everyone was for you to see me as what I am here. A nurse. Yes. And what are you not telling me now?" Emily met his gaze. "The parts that don't help you do your job." Hargreave let out a slow breath. "I trusted you. So did the patient," she replied. "And he's alive." The words landed harder than either of them expected. Before Hargreave could respond, the door opened again. Daniel Ross stepped in alone, this time his expression all business. He closed the door behind him softly. "We're almost set," he said. 10 minutes. Hargreave folded his arms. "You still haven't explained what happens if she says no." Ross looked at Emily, then back at Hargreave. "Then the questions don't stop. They multiply. Investigations start. Files get pulled. People who've never set foot in this hospital begin making decisions about it. And if she says yes," then Ross replied, "we control the narrative." Emily turned toward him. "There shouldn't be a narrative." Ross's mouth tightened. "In our world, there's always a narrative. The only choice is who writes it." Emily looked away. Ross continued, his voice measured. "Right now, we can classify tonight's incident as an anomaly, an undocumented but benign deviation that resulted in a positive outcome. No further action required." Hargreaves snorted. "That sounds like fiction." "It's bureaucracy," Ross said calmly. "Much less imaginative." "And what do you get out of it?" Hargreaves demanded. Ross didn't hesitate. "Confirmation that a capability still exists." Emily's shoulders stiffened. "I'm not a capability." Ross met her gaze evenly. "You were trained as one." The room fell silent again. Hargreave looked between them, his frustration giving way to something closer to alarm. "You're talking about her like she's equipment." "That's how the system sees things," Emily said quietly. "People included." Ross nodded. "Which is why this call matters." The seconds crawled by. The clock now read 1147. Emily felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes, not fear exactly, but the weight of memory pushing against the present. Faces she hadn't allowed herself to picture in years drifted to the surface, hands stained darker than hospital blood, voices shouting coordinates instead of names. She pushed it down. "What about the patient?" she asked suddenly. Ross blinked, surprised by the shift. "What about him? You said he mattered," Emily pressed. "So what happens to him after tonight?" Ross considered his answer. "He'll recover here, quietly. No interviews. No flags in his civilian records." "And when he asks why he lived?" Emily asked. "He won't," Ross said. "People who live through things like that usually don't want answers." Emily frowned. "That's not true." "It's true often enough," Ross replied. The clock ticked to 1150. Hargreave rubbed his temples. "I don't like any of this." "You're not supposed to," Ross said. Emily straightened. "I'll do the call." Ross nodded once. "Good." But she added, "After tonight you leave this place alone." Ross hesitated. "That's not entirely. You got your confirmation," Emily said firmly. "You don't get to keep pulling on the thread." Ross studied her for a long moment. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. "We'll do what we can." "That's not a promise," Hargreave muttered. "No," Ross agreed. "It isn't." Ellison reappeared at the door. "Secure line is up." The words seemed to drain the air from the room. Ross gestured toward the phone, mounted on the wall. A device Emily hadn't even noticed before, its casing darker, heavier than standard hospital equipment. Once you pick it up, Ross said, there's no undoing it. Emily stepped toward the phone. Hargreave reached out, stopping her gently by the arm. Emily. She turned to him. I don't know who you were before tonight, he said quietly. But here now you're one of the best nurses I've ever worked with. Something flickered in her eyes, gratitude maybe, or regret. That's enough, she said. She lifted the receiver. The line crackled once, then steadied. A voice came through, older, authoritative, stripped of pleasantries. This is a secure channel. State your name. Emily swallowed. Emily Carter. A pause. Then, do you confirm that you employed manual vascular override under active hemorrhage conditions at St. Jude Regional Medical Center tonight? Yes, Emily said. Do you confirm that you were trained in this method under classified circumstances? Yes. Another pause, longer this time. And do you confirm, the voice continued, that the method remains viable? Emily closed her eyes for half a second. Yes, she said. The line went silent. Ross watched the clock. 1158. Then the voice returned. Confirmation received. A click. The line went dead. Emily lowered the receiver slowly, her hand steady despite the weight of what she had just done. Ross exhaled. It's done. Hargreave stared at the phone, then at Emily. What did you just give them? Emily met his gaze. Peace of mind. And what did it cost you? She looked away. We'll see. Outside the consultation room, the hospital's overhead lights flickered as the system cycled into a new hour. Midnight arrived quietly, but somewhere far beyond St. Jude. Regional files were closed, decisions finalized, and a woman who had tried very hard to disappear was once again very much on the map. Midnight passed without ceremony. No alarms sounded, no lights dimmed. The hospital did not pause to acknowledge the turning of the hour. Yet something fundamental had shifted all the same, like a fault line slipping deep underground. Emily Carter felt it immediately. She stood in the consultation room, the phone still warm in her hand, listening to the dead silence on the line. The absence of sound felt louder than any voice that could have followed. When she finally placed the receiver back into its cradle, the click echoed sharply in the small space. Daniel Ross checked his watch, then nodded once. It's done, he repeated, more to himself than to anyone else. Dr. Hargreave remained still, eyes fixed on Emily, as if seeing her for the first time and realizing how much he had never seen at all. What happens now? He asked. Ross straightened his jacket. Now we transition. To what Hargreave demanded. To normal, Ross said calmly. As much as possible. Emily let out a quiet breath. There's nothing normal about this. No, Ross agreed. But there is containment. Mark Ellison re-entered the room, his expression tight. We've already rerouted the internal audit request. Administration will be informed that the incident has been reviewed and requires no further action. Hargreave scoffed. That was fast. It had to be, Ellison replied. After midnight, the window narrows. Emily turned to Ross. And the patient, he'll remain under observation, Ross said. His recovery will be unremarkable. Nothing about tonight was unremarkable, Emily said. Ross met her gaze. That's the point. Silence settled again, but this time it carried a different weight, not anticipation, but aftermath. The kind that followed impact. Hargreave broke it. You said questions would stop. They will, Ross replied. From outside. And inside, Hargreave pressed. Ross hesitated for half a second. That depends on how much you're willing to let go. Hargreave's jaw tightened. I don't like being told what I can and can't ask in my own department. I imagine not, Ross said evenly. But you also don't like losing good people. Hargreave glanced at Emily, the conflict plain on his face. Emily spoke before he could. I'm not going anywhere. Ross raised an eyebrow. You're sure? Yes, she said firmly. I told you my terms. And you still intend to honor them? Ross asked. I do, Emily replied. If you don't, this ends differently. Ross studied her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Then he nodded. Understood. Ellison checked his phone again. Transport's been delayed. Delayed? Emily asked. Airspace congestion, Ellison said. Weather shifted. Emily felt the tension spike instantly. What? Transport? Ross answered carefully. There was a contingency plan, for what Hargreave demanded. For extraction, Ross said. If this didn't go the way we hoped. Emily's stomach tightened. You didn't mention that. You didn't ask, Ross replied. Hargreave's voice dropped dangerously low. You were planning to take her. It was an option, Ross said. Not a certainty. Emily crossed her arms. That option is off the table. Ross held her gaze. It already is. Outside, the faint thud-thud-thud of rotor blades reached their ears, distant, rhythmic, unmistakable. Hargreave froze. Tell me it's not for you, Ellison said quickly. Emily moved to the window. Beyond the hospital grounds, barely visible against the dark sky, a helicopter hovered briefly before angling away its navigation lights, blinking red and white. It didn't land. It didn't need to. Just a presence. A reminder. Emily turned back to the room. They wanted insurance. Ross nodded. They wanted reassurance. And now Emily asked. Now Ross said they trust that you'll stay where you are. Hargreave let out a humorless laugh. Trust. That's a generous word. Ross didn't argue. The door opened again and Jenna peeked inside, her eyes wide. They're asking about you at the nurse's station, she said to Emily. Administration. And someone from legal. Emily nodded. I'll handle it. Hargreave stepped forward. No, you won't. She turned to him surprised. This started in my trauma bay, he said. It stays with me. He looked at Ross. You said containment. Then contain it. Ross regarded him thoughtfully. You're taking responsibility. I already am, Hargreave replied. For my department. For my staff. Emily felt something loosen in her chest just slightly. Ross inclined his head. Very well. He gestured to Ellison. We're done here. Ellison opened the door and stepped out, already on his phone. Ross paused beside Emily. You didn't change, he said quietly. She met his gaze. I did. Ross studied her for a long moment. If you ever reconsider, I won't, Emily said. A flicker of something like respect crossed his face. I figured. He left without another word. The consultation room felt emptier once they were gone. Hargreave exhaled slowly. You should have told me. Emily nodded. I know. You still should have. I was afraid, she admitted quietly. That surprised him. Of what? Of being seen, she said. Of being reduced to what I used to be. Hargreave considered that. You saved a life tonight. So did you, Emily replied. They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure how to move forward. Go, Hargreave said finally. I'll deal with administration. Emily hesitated. They won't stop asking questions. They don't need answers, he said. They need paperwork. She gave a faint smile. Thank you. As Emily stepped back into the ER, the familiar sounds washed over her monitor's voices, footsteps, life continuing relentless and ordinary. Jenna met her immediately. What the hell was that? She whispered. Emily met her eyes. A long night. Jenna studied her, then nodded slowly. Patient's asking for you. Emily stiffened. He's awake, briefly, Jenna said. He doesn't remember much, but he keeps saying, the hands. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. I'll go, she said. As she walked down the corridor toward the recovery wing, she felt the weight of what she'd done settle fully into place. The past hadn't reclaimed her, not entirely, but it had made itself known. And for the first time in years, Emily Carter wondered if staying hidden was truly the same as being free. Behind her, in offices far above the hospital floors, reports were finalized, classifications assigned, and tonight's events quietly labeled as resolved. But the silence that followed was not empty. It was watching. The recovery wing smelled different from the ER. Cleaner, quieter. The sharp edge of adrenaline was gone, replaced by antiseptic calm, and the low hum of machines that existed not to save a life in crisis but to guard one already spared. Emily Carter walked slowly down the corridor, her footsteps muted against the polished floor, every sense tuned in despite the stillness. Room 412. She stopped outside the door and took a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Inside, the man lay propped up against pillows, pale but breathing steadily. Tubes traced quiet paths across his body, oxygen, IV fluids monitoring leads. His eyes were open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as he noticed her. You, he said hoarsely. Emily stepped in, closing the door softly behind her. How are you feeling? He blinked, as if surprised by the question. Like I got hit by a truck. A pause. Which, I guess I did. She gave a small smile. That's accurate. He studied her face carefully, brow furrowing. You were there. Before. Yes. In the ER, he continued. When everything went sideways, Emily nodded. I was. He swallowed. I don't remember much. Just pressure. And then, nothing. She moved closer, checking the monitor out of habit. Heart rate steady, blood pressure holding. You did very well, she said. The surgeons took care of the rest. That's not what they told me, he said quietly. Emily looked at him then. What did they tell you that I shouldn't be here, he replied. That whatever happened, it bought me time I wasn't supposed to have. She didn't answer immediately. He watched her closely. You did something. Emily met his gaze, calm and unflinching. I did my job. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. I don't think that's in the standard job description. No, she agreed. It isn't. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with unasked questions. Finally, he spoke again. They said someone might come talk to me. About what I do. Emily's shoulders stiffened slightly. Has anyone? Not yet, he said. But I recognize the look. I've worn it myself. He hesitated. Humility. Emily's eyes flicked briefly to the door, then back to him. Not anymore. That seemed to satisfy him. Figures. He shifted carefully, wincing. You know what's funny? What I've been in places where people bleed out in the dirt because there's no one around who knows what to do, he said. And then I get hurt here of all places and someone uses a technique I've only ever seen once before. Emily's breath slowed. Once overseas, he said. Long time ago. He looked at her intently. Didn't think I'd ever see it again. She said nothing. He nodded slowly. Guess that answers my question. Emily straightened. You should rest. Yeah, he agreed. Probably. As she turned to leave, he called out softly. Hey. She stopped. Whatever it cost you, he said. Thank you. Emily didn't trust her voice, so she simply nodded and slipped out of the room. The corridor felt longer on the way back. As she reached the nurse's station, Jenna looked up immediately. Well, he's stable, Emily said. Jenna studied her face. That's not all, is it? Emily shook her head. It never is. Before Jenna could respond, a woman in a tailored suit approached the desk, her expression polite but firm. Emily Carter, she asked. Yes. I'm Karen Whitmore, the woman said. Hospital legal counsel. Emily felt the familiar tightening in her chest. I was told Dr. Hargreave would handle. He is Whitmore, interrupted gently. But there are a few formalities we need to address. Jenna's eyes widened. Is this about the patient? It's about the incident, Whitmore replied. And the method used. Emily nodded. Of course it is. Whitmore gestured toward a small office off the corridor. Just a few questions. Inside, the air was cool and impersonal. Whitmore took a seat across from Emily, setting a thin folder on the desk. This won't take long, she said. I want to be very clear, the hospital has no intention of disciplining you. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. That's not what Dr. Hargreave thought earlier. Circumstances have changed, Whitmore replied. We've received guidance. Emily almost smiled. Whitmore continued. Officially, the record will state that you applied unconventional but ultimately effective manual pressure under extreme circumstances. Unofficially, Emily asked. Whitmore hesitated. Unofficially, the hospital will not pursue further inquiry. Emily leaned back slightly. That's it. For now, Whitmore said. However, I do need to ask, do you intend to continue practicing here? Yes, Emily said without hesitation. Whitmore studied her. You understand that this may draw attention. I understand that attention fades, Emily replied. Bleeding doesn't. Whitmore closed the folder. Very well. As Emily stood to leave, Whitmore added, for what it's worth, you did the right thing. Emily paused. That depends on who's asking. Whitmore smiled faintly. Doesn't it always? When Emily returned to the ER, the atmosphere had shifted again. Conversations hushed as she passed. A few glances followed her, curious, respectful, uncertain. She took her place without comment, checking vitals, adjusting lines, moving through her tasks with the same quiet efficiency as before. But the weight of what had happened followed her like a shadow. Near the end of her shift, Dr. Hargreave approached, his expression unreadable. They've closed the review, he said. So soon, he nodded. I was advised not to push. Emily met his gaze. And will you? He considered the question carefully. No. That surprised her. I don't like being managed from the outside, he continued. But I like losing people less. He paused. You saved that man's life. So did the team, Emily said. Yes, Hargreave agreed, but you crossed a line no one else could see. Silence settled between them, easier now. You're staying, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he nodded. Good. As dawn crept toward the horizon, Emily finally stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her skin. The hospital loomed behind her, solid and unremarkable, just another building in a city full of them. No helicopters hovered overhead, no voices called her name, but somewhere beyond the waking street's forces she could not see had taken note. And Emily Carter knew with a certainty forged in blood and silence that tonight was not an ending. It was a marker. Morning came slowly, grey and reluctant, as if the sun itself needed time to decide whether it wanted to rise over St. Jude Regional Medical Center. Emily Carter hadn't gone home. She stood at the sink in the staff locker room, scrubbing her hands longer than necessary, watching diluted red swirl down the drain. The water was warm, steady, predictable. Nothing like the night she had just lived through. She dried her hands, slipped on a clean pair of gloves, and returned to the ER. The shift change briefing was already underway. Nurses clustered around the desk, sipping burnt coffee, murmuring updates. A few conversations stopped when Emily approached. Not abruptly, just enough for her to notice. Jenna caught her eye and raised an eyebrow. You okay? Emily nodded once. Dr. Hargreave cleared his throat. All right, he said, his voice carrying. Listen up. Last night was complicated. The patient from the Highway 61 collision is stable. Surgery was successful. No further commentary is needed beyond what's in the chart. A pause. Any questions, he asked. No one spoke. Good, Hargreave said. Let's work. The ER snapped back into motion. For the next 2 hours, Emily moved through routine cases, sprained ankles, chest pains, a kid with a broken arm who tried not to cry in front of his mother. The normal rhythm of the job wrapped around her like a familiar coat. For a brief moment, it almost felt like last night hadn't happened. Almost. At 9:17 a.m., the charge nurse's phone rang. Emily heard the tone change before she saw the expression on the woman's face. Yes, the charge nurse said carefully. Of course. A pause. I'll inform him. She hung up and looked straight at Dr. Hargreave. They're here. Hargreave didn't ask who. Emily felt the air tighten around her chest. Where he asked, Administration conference room, the charge nurse replied. Top floor. Emily didn't move. Hargreave looked at her. You're not required to attend. I know, she said. But if this is about me, Emily continued, I'd rather be in the room. Hargreave studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but you don't speak unless I ask you to. Emily accepted that. Fair. The elevator ride was silent. The doors opened onto a floor that felt different from the rest of the hospital, carpeted, hushed, designed for decisions that never touched blood or bone. The conference room doors were already open. Inside, 3 men and 1 woman sat around the long table. None of them wore uniforms. None of them needed to. The woman stood as they entered, her posture immaculate, her expression neutral. Dr. Hargreave, she said, extending a hand. Thank you for meeting with us on such short notice. Hargreave shook it. I'm told you have questions. Yes, she replied. I'm Laura Finch, Department of Defense Liaison. Emily felt the words settle heavily in her stomach. Finch's gaze shifted to her, not lingering but deliberate. Assessing. And you are Emily Carter, Finch said. Emily nodded. Yes. Finch gestured for everyone to sit. We'll be brief. One of the men slid a thin folder across the table toward Hargreave. It stopped, just short of Emily's reach. Last night, Finch continued, a patient under your care survived a hemorrhagic event with a mortality rate exceeding 98%. Hargreave folded his hands. Medicine surprises us sometimes. Occasionally, Finch agreed, but not like this. She turned the folder so that Hargreave could see the top page, graphs, timestamps, vitals recorded in unforgiving precision. The bleeding slowed before surgical intervention, Finch said, in a way that aligns with a very specific technique. Hargreaves' jaw tightened. "You're implying I'm stating," Finch interrupted calmly, "that Nurse Carter applied a method developed outside civilian medicine." Emily felt every eye in the room shift to her. "She acted to save a life," Hargreaves said firmly. "And that is precisely why we're here," Finch replied. "To ensure that such actions don't create complications." "What kind of complications?" Hargreaves asked. Finch smiled faintly. "Jurisdictional ones." Silence followed. One of the men spoke for the first time. "We are not here to discipline anyone." Emily almost laughed. "We are here," he continued, "to assess risk." Hargreaves leaned back. "To whom?" "To systems," Finch answered. "To boundaries." Emily finally spoke, and people. Finch met her gaze. "People are always part of the calculation." Emily's voice stayed level. "Then calculate this. A man lived because I didn't wait." Another pause. Finch nodded slowly. "That's not in dispute." "Then why are we?" Emily asked. Finch folded her hands on the table. "Because what you did last night wasn't just effective. It was repeatable." The word landed hard. "You're concerned it might spread," Hargreaves said. "We're concerned," Finch corrected, "that it might be used without context." Emily exhaled slowly. "Context doesn't stop bleeding." "No," Finch agreed. "Training does." Emily leaned forward slightly. "Then maybe the problem isn't that the technique exists." Finch's expression sharpened. "Careful." Maybe Emily continued evenly. "The problem is who you think is allowed to use it." The room went still. One of the men shifted in his seat. Finch studied Emily carefully now, the neutrality cracking just enough to reveal something like curiosity. "You walked away," Finch said. "You chose a civilian life." "Yes." And yet, Finch continued, "you retained the skill." "Yes." Why Emily didn't answer immediately. Because some things never leave you, she thought. Because sometimes the world needs what it refuses to acknowledge. Because people bleed everywhere, Emily said aloud. Hargreaves felt a strange swell of something, pride, maybe, or unease. Finch closed the folder. "We are not here to take you," she said to Emily, "nor to expose you." Emily waited, but Finch added, "We will be monitoring." Hargreaves bristled. "This is a hospital, not a staging ground." Finch met his gaze. "Then keep it one." She stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "No reports will be filed, no statements made. The incident will be classified as resolved." And Emily, Hargreaves asked. Finch looked at her one last time. "She continues her work." The group filed out as quietly as they had arrived. The conference room felt hollow after they left. Hargreaves turned to Emily. "You didn't have to challenge them." "Yes," Emily said softly. "I did." He studied her. "You realize they won't forget this." "I didn't ask them to," she replied. As they returned to the elevator, Hargreaves finally said the thing that had been sitting between them since the night before. "They underestimated you." Emily looked at him. "So did you." He didn't argue. The elevator doors opened onto the familiar chaos of the ER. Stretchers rolled by. Voices called out vitals. Life continued. Emily stepped back into it without ceremony. But somewhere far above the hospital rooflines had been redrawn, not loudly, not publicly, but enough to matter. The story was no longer just about a nurse who stopped the bleeding. It was about what happens when quiet competence collides with systems built on control. And the real test, Emily knew, was still ahead. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, small shifts, subtle changes that only someone attuned to pressure and pattern would notice. Emily Carter felt them immediately as she stepped back into the ER after the meeting. Conversations paused a fraction too long. Eyes followed her just a second more than before. No hostility, no awe, just awareness. Awareness was dangerous. By early afternoon, word had spread, not details, not facts, but something vaguer and harder to control. Something happened last night. Administration got involved. Federal people were upstairs. The story changed with every retelling, but the center of it always circled back to one name: Emily Carter. She kept her head down, focused on her patients. A man with crushing chest pain, a woman dizzy from dehydration, a toddler with a fever that wouldn't break. The work was grounding, honest. Bodies didn't care about authority or jurisdiction. They responded to action or they didn't. Near the end of her shift, Jenna approached her quietly. "They reassigned you," she said. Emily looked up. "Reassigned. Not officially. Jenna clarified. You're still trauma. But Dr. Hargreave adjusted the rotation. You won't be primary on incoming criticals for a while. Emily absorbed that without reaction. His call. Yeah, Jenna said. But it doesn't feel like punishment. It's protection, Emily replied. Jenna studied her. From who? Emily didn't answer. At 4:22 p.m., a new patient came in, middle-aged male, severe abdominal pain, hypotensive, unclear source, a standard case on paper. Emily assisted from the perimeter, watching the team work. Something was wrong. She felt it before she could articulate it, the way the man's breathing didn't match the monitor, the way his pain response was delayed. She stepped closer. Doctor, she said quietly to the attending Dr. Lewis. His pressure drop doesn't match the scan. Lewis frowned. We're still waiting on imaging. I know, Emily said, but he's bleeding somewhere, we're not looking. Lewis hesitated. Emily, you're not assigned. I'm not asking to lead, she interrupted calmly. I'm asking you to listen. He studied her face, then glanced at the monitor. Something in her tone measured certain cut through his resistance. All right, he said. What do you see? She pointed. Retroperitoneal bleed. It's subtle, but it's there. Lewis ordered a focused scan. She was right. The room shifted instantly. Orders changed. Movement sharpened. The patient stabilized long enough to get to surgery. Afterward, Lewis pulled her aside. You could have let that go, he said. Emily met his gaze. People don't bleed on schedules. Lewis nodded slowly. I owe you. You owe the patient, she replied. By the time Emily changed out of her scrubs, the sun was already low in the sky. Her body ached with familiar fatigue, but her mind refused to slow. She didn't go home. Instead, she drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, letting the city blur past her windshield. Billboards, gas stations, ordinary life continuing at a pace that felt unreal. She finally parked near a quiet overlook outside town, engine idling as she stared out at the horizon. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it ring once, twice, then answered. Emily Carter, she said. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and unmistakably new. This is Laura Finch. Emily closed her eyes briefly. I thought you said this was resolved. It is, Finch replied. This isn't official. That doesn't make it better, Emily said. Finch paused. I wanted to speak to you directly, without witnesses, without posturing. Emily said nothing. You challenged us this morning, Finch continued. Not with defiance, with logic. Emily stared out at the darkening sky. I wasn't trying to make a point. You did, Finch said, whether you intended to or not. What do you want? Emily asked. Perspective, Finch replied, and honesty. Emily let out a quiet breath. You already have my file. Yes, Finch said. But files don't explain why someone walks away and keeps walking until they end up here. Maybe, Emily said, I just wanted to do something that didn't require permission to save a life. Finch was silent for a moment. Do you regret it? No. Even now. Especially now, Emily replied. Finch considered that. You know there are people who will try to turn what you know into policy. I know, Emily said, and others who will try to bury it, Finch added. I know that too. Finch sighed softly. You're standing in the middle whether you want to be or not. Emily's voice stayed steady. I'm standing exactly where I chose to. Another pause. We won't contact you again, Finch said finally, unless you reach out to us. That's not a promise, Emily said. No, Finch agreed, but it's close. The call ended. Emily sat there for a long time after that phone, dark in her hand. When she finally drove home, the city lights had come fully alive. She showered, ate without tasting the food, and collapsed onto her couch, exhaustion finally dragging her under. Sleep came fast, and with it memories she rarely allowed. Hands covered in dust instead of gloves. Shouted coordinates instead of vitals. Blood that didn't stop no matter how hard she tried. She woke before dawn, heart racing. For a long moment she lay still, listening to the quiet of her apartment. No alarms, no rotor blades. Just the hum of a refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. She breathed until her pulse slowed. When she returned to St. Jude that morning, the atmosphere felt different again, less tense, more focused. The story was already fading, absorbed into the endless churn of hospital life. Dr. Hargreave caught her near the nurse's station. "I adjusted the schedule again," he said. Emily waited. "You're back on primary trauma," he continued. "Effective immediately." She searched his face. "You sure?" he nodded. "If people are watching, I want them to see us doing our jobs. Nothing more, nothing less." Emily considered that, then nodded. "All right." As the first ambulance of the day pulled in, lights flashing, Emily took her place at the trauma bay entrance. She didn't know what the future held, whether tonight's choices would echo louder than she wanted or fade into institutional memory, like so many others. But she knew this: if someone bled in front of her, she would act, permission or not. And somewhere far beyond St. Jude's walls, people who believed control mattered more than lives were quietly adjusting their assumptions, because they had just seen proof of something they couldn't unsee. The ambulance doors burst open just after 8:06 Rain slicked the pavement outside St. Jude Regional, the sky low and heavy, pressing the city into a muted grey. Paramedics shouted vitals as they wheeled the gurney through the automatic doors. Female, mid-40s, blunt abdominal trauma from a construction site, fall, hypotensive, altered mental status. Emily Carter was already moving. She didn't hesitate this time. No one questioned her place at the head of the bed. "Doctor!" Hargreave stood beside her, issuing orders with crisp efficiency, but his eyes kept flicking to Emily, not with doubt, but with trust. BP's dropping a resident called out. Emily watched the patient's breathing, the subtle hitch in her chest, the way her skin tone didn't match the numbers on the screen. The pattern was familiar. Too familiar. "Internal bleed," Emily said calmly. "Deep, not obvious." The resident frowned. "CT hasn't confirmed." "It won't yet," Emily interrupted gently. "But it will." Hargreave met her gaze for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. "Prep blood," he ordered. "Or on standby." The team moved as one. As they worked, Emily felt it again, that tightening, that awareness that came when time narrowed to a single thread. She adjusted pressure, guided hands, corrected angles without raising her voice. This time no one shouted about protocol. No one accused her of improvising. They listened. The patient stabilized enough for imaging. The scan lit up exactly where Emily had predicted. "Good call," the radiologist murmured. Emily didn't respond. She was already thinking 2 steps ahead. When the patient was rushed upstairs, the trauma bay exhaled. Jenna leaned against the counter, shaking her head. "You know," she said quietly, "if this keeps up, people are going to start asking how you see these things." Emily wiped her hands. "They already are. And I'm still just doing my job." Jenna studied her. "You really believe that, don't you?" "Yes," Emily said simply. Word traveled fast, not as rumor this time, but as something more solid. Confidence. Trust. The kind that didn't need explanation. By mid-morning, Dr. Hargreave called a brief huddle. "Listen up," he said. "I want to be clear. We don't chase theories. We don't cut corners. We treat patients. We rely on our training and on each other." His gaze lingered on Emily for just a beat longer. "That includes listening when someone sees what we don't." No one argued. Later, as the ER settled into its rhythm, Emily felt a presence before she saw it. A man stood near the entrance, late 50s posture, straight eyes scanning the room with practiced detachment. He wore a simple suit, no badge visible, but the way people unconsciously shifted around him marked him as something else. Authority, without announcement. He approached the desk. "Emily Carter." She turned. "Yes. I'm here to observe," he said, briefly. Hargreave appeared at her side almost immediately. On whose authority the man met his gaze. "Mine will do." Emily felt the old instinct stir, the one that read rooms and weighed exits. Observation of what she asked. "Of you," he replied, "and of this place." Hargreave bristled. "We've already." "It won't take long," the man said calmly. "I won't interfere." Emily considered him for a moment, then nodded. "Fine." He stayed for nearly an hour. He watched without comment as Emily worked, how she listened more than she spoke, how she guided younger staff without undermining them, how she stepped back when others took the lead and stepped forward only when it mattered. At one point, a critical patient came in, a teenager with a gunshot wound. Chaos flared, then tightened under Emily's steady presence. The bleed was controlled. The patient stabilized. Lives moved back from the edge. When it was over, the man approached her again. "You haven't lost it," he said quietly. Emily met his gaze. "Lost what? Your restraint," he replied. She understood then who he was, not by name, not by title, but by the weight he carried. Someone who had once signed off on decisions that didn't leave room for nurses or hospitals or quiet choices. "I didn't keep it for you," Emily said. A flicker of something like approval crossed his face. "Good." Hargreave watched them from a distance, unease coiling in his chest. When the man finally turned to leave, Hargreave intercepted him. "This department isn't an experiment," Hargreave said firmly. The man nodded. "No, it's a standard." Hargreave stiffened. "For what?" "For what happens when you trust the right people," the man replied. He left without another word. Emily didn't ask who he was. She didn't need to. By late afternoon, exhaustion settled into her bones, but it was a clean kind of tired, the kind that came from work done well. As she finished charting, Hargreave approached her quietly. "You could have been anything," he said. Emily looked up. "I am," he nodded. "That's not what I meant." "I know," she replied. He hesitated. "They're not going to stop watching." "No," Emily agreed. "But they don't get to decide what I do when someone's bleeding." Hargreave studied her, then smiled faintly. "I won't pretend to understand everything about you. That makes two of us," Emily said. As her shift ended, she stepped outside into the cool evening air. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking thin bands of orange and gold, stretching across the horizon. No helicopters circled overhead. No calls came through. Just the quiet aftermath of a day where lives were saved not because of authority but because of trust. Emily stood there for a moment, letting the calm settle. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges. Questions. Pressures. Lines drawn by people far removed from trauma bays and blood-slick floors. But tonight, justice had taken a quieter form. Not exposure. Not punishment. Recognition. The hospital slowed as night returned. St. Jude Regional always did its energy ebbing into something steadier, more deliberate, as the day staff handed over to the night shift. The fluorescent lights dimmed a fraction, voices softened. Even the beeping monitors seemed to find a calmer rhythm. Emily Carter stood at the trauma bay entrance, watching the changeover with the quiet awareness of someone who understood transitions better than most. Not just shifts, lives, identities. She had stayed late again. Not because she was needed, but because she wanted to be certain the day ended the way it should, without loose ends, without unfinished tension hanging in the air. Jenna approached, shrugging into her jacket. "You coming in a minute," Emily said. Jenna studied her. "You know people are talking." Emily smiled faintly. "They always do." "This time it's different," Jenna said. "They're not guessing. They're reassessing." Emily glanced back toward the ER. "That won't last." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "Why not? Because the work keeps moving," Emily replied. "And attention doesn't." Jenna nodded slowly. "You're a strange one, Carter. I've been called worse." Jenna laughed and headed for the exit. Emily remained where she was. Down the corridor, room 412's door stood slightly open. The patient she had saved was asleep now, his breathing, even his chart finally boring. No restricted access warnings, no red flags. Just a name and a recovery plan. Normal. Doctor. Hargreave appeared beside her, hands in his coat pockets. Administration signed off on everything he said. No conditions, no follow-ups. Emily nodded. "Good. They asked if you wanted a commendation," he added. She turned to look at him. "I don't. I figured," he said. "I declined on your behalf. Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a nurse guide a gurney down the hall, the wheels humming softly against the floor. "You know," Hargreave said at last, "I built my career on rules." Emily glanced at him. "Protocols. Chains of command. Clear lines," he continued. "They keep people alive, most of the time." "Yes," Emily said, "most of the time. But sometimes," he admitted, "they keep people from acting." Emily didn't respond. "I won't pretend I'm comfortable with everything you do," Hargreave said, "but I trust why you do it." She met his gaze. "That's enough." Hargreave nodded once. "Go home." Emily finally did. Outside, the city lights flickered against the dark sky. The air was cool, clean after the rain. She walked to her car slowly, letting the quiet wrap around her. As she drove, her phone buzzed. A message. Unknown sender. You did the right thing. No signature, no follow-up. Emily stared at the screen for a moment, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. She didn't need confirmation anymore. At home, she sat on the edge of her bed, unlacing her shoes with deliberate care. The adrenaline of the past 2 days had finally faded, leaving behind a deeper exhaustion and something else. A sense of alignment she hadn't felt in years. She thought of who she had been once, of training rooms with no windows, of instructors who spoke in absolutes, of missions measured in success or failure, never in consequences. She had believed then that silence was survival, but hospitals had taught her something different. Silence here wasn't absence, it was space. Space to notice. Space to act when others froze. Space to choose compassion over command. The next morning came quietly. Emily returned to St. Jude as she always did, early, prepared, unremarkable. No one stopped her. No one questioned her presence. She checked the board, tied her hair back, and stepped into the flow of the day. A new trauma alert came in mid-morning. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy. Just another human being bleeding somewhere they shouldn't. Emily moved without hesitation. No eyes followed her this time. No whispers trailed behind. Just colleagues, working together, trusting one another to do what needed to be done. Later, as she washed her hands at the sink, Emily caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked the same, but she wasn't. She had learned that justice didn't always arrive with authority or exposure. Sometimes it came quietly when the right person was allowed to do the right thing without being stopped. She dried, her hands turned back to the ER, and stepped forward. Because bleeding didn't wait for permission, and neither would she. Some of the most powerful people you will ever meet don't wear ranks, titles, or uniforms. They stand quietly in the background, underestimated, unheard, until the moment everything goes wrong. This story isn't about breaking rules for the sake of rebellion. It's about understanding why rules exist and recognizing when they are no longer enough. True courage doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It acts when hesitation would cost a life. Emily Carter didn't save anyone to prove a point. She didn't act for praise, power, or permission. She acted because she saw what needed to be done and refused to look away. In a world obsessed with authority and control, sometimes the greatest justice is simply allowing the right hands to do their work. Have you ever been underestimated only to realize your quiet strength mattered more than anyone knew? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe in stories where integrity wins without noise, don't forget to subscribe.